went and I was talking about Eastern Europe and Latin America, they said, it's very mysterious. She's Polish, but she lives in Buenos Aires. And so I think you probably did this first. And the collaboration with Cristina Frera was very much me piggybacking onto something that she was doing, because I was working on artists' networks, and then somehow I heard through the grapevine that there was going to be this special issue of Art Margins, which was a new journal then, and it's such a great journal, and Sven Speaker has done so much important stuff. And so I emailed and said, oh, can I be involved in it? And so that's how that happened. But Cristina was already doing this long before. But it was fun to work on that with her, and I learned a lot. So I began working a bit on these intersections between Eastern Europe and Latin America, partly as a way to try to get out of working only in a kind of area studies way, because I did feel, after having done my PhD on East Central European art, that there was a sense in which one kept coming across the same names, the same theorists, and you kind of got to a bit of a point of methodological stagnation, or at least I felt that I had. And I thought it was productive to see what kinds of methodologies and ideas scholars working in other fields were pursuing. When I first started working at the Courtauld, I was very lucky because Sarah was away for a year, so I got to teach her course on global conceptualism. And that was also an inspiration, because it stretched me to think beyond the area studies model, and to think this was a course that Sarah and Boris Groys devised together. And I was lucky enough to be able to help teach that. And so that also got me thinking about the use value of teaching comparatively, and trying to think beyond area studies. But I wasn't brave enough to try to, when I was given the opportunity to devise my own MA course, I wasn't brave enough to try to do the whole world. So I stuck with some regions where I had some of the language skills. And it's been really interesting. I've been running this course called Countercultures, Alternative Art in Eastern Europe and Latin America, since, I think, 2012, about 10 years. And a group of the students are here on the left, which is really great, so we can ask them for their opinions a bit later on. So what I thought I'd do this morning is just take you through the course, really, because I know that many of you teach, and I don't think anybody else teaches East European and Latin American art together in quite this way. So I thought it might be interesting to share with you how the course has panned out, and to open out maybe into a discussion of some of its strengths and weaknesses. The first thing that the course inevitably does is kind of cut out mainstream Western European and North American art history. And one can kind of do that, I think, perhaps at any stage, but at MA level particularly easily, because we're fortunate to have students who already know quite a lot when they come to us. And I quite like this map, which I found, which shows this operation. But it's an interesting kind of art historical experiment, I suppose, as well, to plunge straight into two historical Cold War margins without feeling the compulsion to also talk about the centers. And that was quite sort of programmatic. So Christina yesterday was talking about the move from margins to mainstream, and that was kind of one of the aims of my course, and has been, to teach this work without having to relate it all the time to Paris or New York. which doesn't mean that Paris and New York are not present, but they are on the peripheries of the course compared with Prague or Buenos Aires, say. This is the little course blurb, and I'm not going to read it all, but the kind of there are three key points here of what we look at. So countercultural activities designed to subvert censorship, challenge political orthodoxy, and produce alternative models of solidarity, analyzing moral encounters between alternative art and mechanisms of military and state repression. That's one kind of set of concerns. Another set of concerns is kind of more methodological, about drawing parallels between formally similar practices, but without losing a sense of their ideological specificity, considering the challenges of developing a new global art history, that word new again, perhaps I should delete that, beyond national and regional frameworks, trying to work outwards from artistic propositions and actions towards social and political theory, exploring how artists' projects are embedded in global power structures. And finally, a kind of a shared set of concerns, I think, across our two regions, thinking about the imperatives of an art that was developed outside a market context, and thinking about this in relation to recent moves to recuperate this formerly invisible past by delayed international audiences. And one of the things that we used to do with Sarah when we interviewed people for this course was to show them these two images and tell them a little bit about this Hungarian monument by Gyula Konkoli, shown in an exhibition in Budapest, which is a big block of ice sprinkled with sulfur, so that when the ice melts, the bandages seep and become red and drip onto the floor. Comparing this with Arturo Barrio's bloody bundles here in Belo Horizonte in an outdoor exhibition, which are carcasses of animals and so on, again, bleeding. And we were interested in what students would do with this comparison, this kind of traditional art historical comparative methodology. But there was a kind of a tension, I think, between the kind of apparently formal similarities and but also kind of quite major, of course, political differences that we wanted students to think about. So, and it was just always interesting, and getting people to think about why one might want to compare Eastern Europe and Latin America in political and artistic terms, and what are these similarities, and things that people, always talk about was, violence, Marxism, repression, Catholicism, in some cases colonialism, more so now. That's something that people talk about more now. But I think also thinking about the problems and the very significant differences. So that was a kind of a starting point also for my thinking. And although the course brings together the two regions, it doesn't really follow this direct traditional art historical model of comparing. Some classes are comparative, others are much more focused. So we kind of zoom in and zoom out. And the course is arranged thematically, and although technically it begins with the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and ends in 1989, in fact, we begin a little bit earlier, and we begin with film. So the first class is called Visions of Revolution, and we watch and talk about a series of movies. We focus in particular on the Soviet Cuban collaboration Soy Cuba, and Eisenstein's Que Viva Mexico, which has been reconstructed and kind of re-put together from the reels of film, even though it was not finished. And that's a nice way of thinking about shared revolutionary histories, but also significant differences between the Russian Revolution and its ambitions and the Mexican Revolution. And thinking about how major filmmakers have used film to think about inequality and radical politics. So it's kind of light on the history, if you see what I mean, because we are entering into the history through the filmic representation, filtered through the lens of the visual right from the beginning. Then we turn to some historical concrete connections between people, and we look at the kind of nexus of traveling ideas and shared dialogues in the 1930s, thinking in particular about this manifesto that was co-authored with Breton and Rivera, for a manifesto for artistic freedom. And so we discuss Trotsky's significance and his ideas on culture and their kind of global appeal, and the contacts between the surrealists, muralists, and Frida Kahlo's kind of centrality within this network. Ending with these works, which I think people are often very surprised by. Everybody loves Frida Kahlo, and people don't often think of Frida Kahlo making these portraits of herself with Stalin just after Stalin's death. So that's kind of part of the backstory. The final backstory is a class on centers, peripheries, exchanges, and transformations, where I think a bit about kind of shared formative experiences in Paris and the links with Paris. And here's a case studies are the Czech surrealism, Toyen and Styrsky, and so on, the work of Tadeusz Kantor, and the spread of Parisian informel, as well as the development of the language of universal constructivism, the Mahdi group, a bit about these international magazine networks, and the kind of universalist ambitions of this interwar avant-garde, ending with Wilfredo Lam's very interesting play on hybridizing his encounter with Picasso and Cubism, and turning it into something much more interesting and complex from today's point of view. So that's the kind of centers and peripheries class. We then kind of deep dive into Brazil, and we look at the passage from concretism and neo-concretism. Again, there's a bit of an opportunity here for some shared experience when we think about the kind of the language of concretism in sculpture, and Max Bill and so on, and then moving into concrete poetry through groups such as the Noagandres. We look at Clark, Oiticica, and so that's a kind of within a sort of a national framework, but thinking about how the these kind of more universal concerns are explored in the work of particular groups of artists in Rio and Sao Paulo. The next class moves into fluxus and happenings, and it's the beginning of thinking too about the kind of simultaneous processing of pop and fluxus at the same time, and we begin to think about dematerialization and the important text of Oscar Masota. After pop, we dematerialize. So this is really where the course, I suppose, kind of begins properly. And the development of happenings is very much in parallel in the mid-1960s. And there are very interesting, shared sets of concerns among artists who are adopting this international language of the happening in very sophisticated ways. So the happening for a dead ball, which is this famous happening which never happened but was only disseminated through the media in Buenos Aires, and epic canonical events such as Tadeusz Kantor's Panoramic Sea happening. Sorry, there's something has appeared on my screen. Gone. Okay. So I try, and I'm interested to try to highlight in this course local theoretical debates as much as possible, and to try to bring to the fore theorists who might not be the most canonical theorists of a genre such as the happenings. Happenings, the way that it's taught, at least in the UK and in the US, are always taught through the writing of Alan Capro. But it's interesting to think about teaching happenings in relation to the writings of Masota, for example. So, there's just more examples of works that obviously share sets of concerns. Oiticica's Eden with, say, Saglova's Hay Straw, the same year, remarkably similar types of propositions by artists who probably weren't aware of what one another were doing, but were very much thinking along quite similar lines. Artists who are also thinking very much internationally. Marta Minuin's Simultaneity and Simultaneity as a project that tries to bring together simultaneously three happenings in three different cities, I think is very interesting and paradigmatic, and to think about in dialogue with, as a model for what we're also trying to do in this kind of an art history, which is, what Piotr called a horizontal art history, I suppose, where you're slicing through time, looking at parallel developments in different countries. Thinking in relation to repressive political circumstances, again in parallel with the introduction of normalization in Czechoslovakia, with the boarding up and the closure of the 1968 exhibition, which was such a kind of a crisis on the Buenos Aires scene, where artists sort of made their kind of decisions about whether they were going to move into forms of activism. Was art and was the artistic sphere enough anymore for people? So this is happening in both of our regions at the same time, and opens into a class which is about ideological conceptualism, which has been this kind of important structural debate in relation to Latin American art that Zana Gilbert very brilliantly kind of contributed to, taking issue with some of the earlier accounts of what makes Latin American art specific, its kind of specific relationship to the body and to the politics, that earlier, that kind of a first generation of theorists had proposed, then younger scholars like Miguel Lopez and Zana Gilbert, were calling this into question, and quite rightly, and saying, well, isn't everything ideological? And that's certainly, my perspective on this, that that, as Jarosław was saying yesterday, everything is political, and I don't want, this course is absolutely not about trying to say that art in Eastern Europe and Latin America is political and American art isn't political. We can just be formalists in relation to American art. But we talk in this class about insertions into ideological circuits as a strategy, not just a strategy associated with Mireles' work, but as a strategy that conceptual artists are doing, are engaged in different ways in different places. We talk about the question of that boundary between social engagement and activism, which is, yes, how do you use, or can you, to what extent can you use the visual and conceptual strategies and strategies of media to make a change in the world, to effect concrete change, and who's tried to do that and at what risk? We discuss Louis Kamnitz's very kind of bold, but also for some people problematic proposal that the kind of ultimate conceptual artists are a group such as the Uruguayan Tupamaros. Again, thinking about this relationship between different types of action and engagement, and discussing the history of the idea of the cultural guerrilla in relation to different theorizations of guerrilla warfare on the one hand, and then the guerrilla activist as a cultural worker on the other, bearing in mind, for example, Germano Celant's very influential text published in Flash Art, which was about the guerrilla about the arte povera and experimental artists as kinds of guerrilla fighters. Then there's another kind of a more focused case study on Moscow romantic conceptualism, which begins to call into questions the kinds of accounts that have been advanced, in this case by Boris Groys, to try to make a case for the specificity of particular scenes. And we kind of look critically at how he does that, what are the kind of strengths and then historical, weaknesses of this. I'm looking here, I hear that I see you guys whispering over here, but that's because you are talking about Bratislava conceptualism, and you are the author also. We could make a case study about you and your Bratislava conceptualism discussion, because this was absolutely the same kind of thing that we're talking about. How do you use that as a kind of a strategic tool? Sarah has also, here we talk about Sarah's very brilliant article, Moscow Romantic Exceptionalism, where she pointed out that perhaps the Moscow conceptualism was less exceptional than it is sometimes claimed, and that lots of other people were doing quite similar things. And we talk about whether that matters, whether it doesn't matter. What do we do with the fact that people say they had no idea of what was going on, but are ostensibly doing exactly the same thing as Robert Smithson say? Is that a problem? Should we talk about that? And so on. So this is quite a kind of Moscow-centric class. Then we shift to Chile, and it's a big jump, but we're thinking here we're diving back into well, it's not a huge jump because it's linked. I think I linked these classes originally because the question of collective action. This is you have Moscow conceptualism and collective actions, and then you have the group with the same name, Collective Actions of Santiago de Chile, but they're proposing a different kind of a model of collectivity and engagement. Where they are working in the public space, delivering milk to the poor, obviously in relation to the the withdrawal of that offer of milk that had been kind of iconic of the Allende promise. And so that's quite a focused class, which is on them. And I find that in this class, we always wind up talking about class, actually. We always wind up talking about how, well, okay, well, these artists are kind of reaching out to the poor and so on. But, I mean, how did they manage to get... to get private airplanes to drop leaflets? Weren't they very rich themselves? And how can you kind of have a class solidarity between these wealthy middle class artists and the poor? And isn't this all just very problematic and performative? And I think that's, an important question, which obviously artists themselves were also aware of. And is thematized by the work of somebody like Clemente Padin later, who we talk about. So then we have a kind of a more theoretical class, which really looks at kind of key texts and political theories. I'm very interested in theories of anti-politics and that were written about in East Central Europe by people like Georgi Konrad, and this kind of politics outside politics, the politics of friendship, Václav Havel's ideas of living in truth, which appeal a lot to some students, and to other students completely don't appeal and seem ridiculously out of date. There's always quite a strong kind of response to Havel because he's quite easy to understand, and for some people they really like that, and other people find him very frustrating, so that makes for good discussion. And in the same class with the Havel, I also bring in, which again is probably completely unorthodox and a huge leap, Paulo Freire, and we read some chapters from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and we think here about the questions of because it relates very clearly to the power of the powerless. So in Freire, this kind of pedagogical educational mission to help people to become literate and so on is about making people realize that they can have a voice. And I think on some level, Havel, a lot of what he's writing about in the 80s is also about trying to make ordinary individual people realize that if they have a voice and they use it, then it can produce change collectively. So we engage in discussions about that. And in this class, we focus on Hungarian work in particular. A lot of the stuff which here I owe Magda a debt, because Magda was writing her PhD. Magda actually learned Hungarian, which is miraculous, and was writing her PhD on Hungarian conceptualism with Piotr, and Piotr told me about Magda's work, and I think Magda might well have given me her PhD draft to read, which was, thank you, a big way in for me to the Hungarian art scene, and I never learned Hungarian, and poor David has very kindly been helping me to, now I can use Google Translate though, which is great, but then it leaves other people to pick up the mess of the terrible Google translation. And I also thank Emeshe, who did so much work on Szent-Jobbé, who remains absolutely my favorite artist of all of these artists. And here is his really wonderful work, Be Forbidden, where you have to cross over this barrier, and then you see it because the writing is too small, and then you see the little text which says Be Forbidden, and it works on so many levels about transgressing boundaries. And so this is a class then which is also about the generation of 1968 in East Central Europe, and is about solidarity and the expression of Czech-Hungarian friendship that the artists enact at Balaton-Boglar. In the event that Laszlo Becker coordinated. We then shift to consideration of the public and the private, and at my own peril, I get the students to read Hannah Arendt in full knowledge that I cannot completely explain it to them. But I always hope that they will explain it to me, and they quite often do. But that's really useful in kind of unhinging what we think we know about these public and private spaces, and where is it that politics happens, because we also read here the very brilliant text by Bojana Page, Proletarians of the World, Who Washes Your Socks?, in which she points out that in the political context of the Soviet satellite countries, often the space of politics became the domestic space. Where gender relations remained often absolutely unchallenged, and you had, male dissidents sitting around at the kitchen table while women peeled potatoes in the kitchen. In this class, we look at bringing art and politics into the home, into the domestic space, and through the work of Kemp-Welch in particular. And we look at their home and studio as a site for meetings between artists from different countries. We think about who the audience was. We think about small communities and small audiences, groups of friends, through the work of an artist like Jiří Kovanda, and then through the work of Ion Grigorescu, who is becoming his own audience, for whom the camera is his audience, and who in his domestic space is exploring these questions around self-surveillance, boxing himself and so on, running the same tape through his camera on film through his camera on several occasions. Then Gender Check, I've just borrowed the class title from the exhibition. We think about art. We look at artists in both regions in this class who are dealing with gender and sexuality and performativity, such as, for example, Natalia LL or Sanja Ivekovic. Then we look at mail art networks, and we look through the particular individual archives. I talk here in this class about the NET project. We also discuss the network around Andrzej Partom, who founded in Warsaw the Bureau of Poetry and was visited, among many others, by Jorge Glusberg here. And Zofia Kulik tells this kind of amazing story of how she and Kwiek were just completely in awe of Glusberg's camera. He was just kind of wandering around casually with his pipe with some crazily expensive camera that was just making everybody salivate. And then, in this class, we look at the Kaik exhibitions, which Christina and other people have already mentioned, these festivals that took place from a distance. I went and did some archival research in Sao Paulo, and I was looking at the correspondence as well with between Zanini and Glusberg, so I'm able to include there some materials from this correspondence. I also did archival research in the archive of Edgardo Antonio Vigo, and was looking there for the correspondence with East European artists. And there was a really wonderful correspondence with Paweł Petasz and Robert Rayfeld. So we look at, and here's a postcard by Becker, so as to kind of show how these exchanges and contacts were, produced very much, as Jarosław was saying and Christina was saying, on an individual level from the ground up. And it's so important to go to so many different archives, to get a picture of these different connections and the friendships that really developed. Cristina already mentioned the campaign to liberate Padin and Caraballo, which is a very particular case. Coming towards the end now, we then shift into questions of exile, diaspora in the 80s, and look at this through the lens of site-specific installations that artists make while living abroad. So Tropicalia is one, of course, which is a kind of very archetypal and a kind of extraordinary condensation of something which, you know, could be quintessentially local, and yet is transported around the world as kind of this weird condensation of a historical moment. But we've already looked at Tropicalia in the Brazil class, but this addresses the same issue, particularly through the work of Ilya Kabakov, who emigrates in the 80s and is making major total installations dealing with Soviet life and its history, such as the big archive, this kind of nightmarish maze, bureaucratic maze, or his first 10 characters show in 1988 at the Robert Feldman Fine Arts. And so we think about what is being staged here and how complex that is, and what happens to art which kind of tries to condense something about a historical moment or a personal experiences within a repressive context which somebody has now left, and how these sorts of installations are tinged with nostalgia, but of some kind, but also in some respects stage repression and abjection, most notably here, of course, for the benefit of a kind of international art world audience. And what's involved in those processes. And Sildo Meirelles is our other case study in this class too, with his installations that again very often address violence, colonial histories, and so on. And the final class, sometimes I do this as two separate classes, this year we did it as one, I think, is about remembering. So remembering actually existing socialism, remembering military dictatorship, primarily through photography and film. And this is also about negotiating these difficult pasts, often from a personal point of view, and how artists' practices sometimes change in the 90s. So this is a work from Boris Mikhailov's very famous series of case histories, where he shows the losers of socialism. And we watched this year Henri Sala's amazing film Intervista, which is very, very useful for opening out a discussion about negotiating memory. And he, it does this incredible interview with his mother, confronting her about her past as a militant within the regime of Enver Hoxha in Albania. And she's initially in denial, and then she comes to say, well, actually, no, we believed in those ideals. And there's a kind of an interesting discussion with an elderly couple who'd spent 16 years in prison, where the woman says, well, there were two kinds of people. There were people who knew what was going on, and then there were people who were idealists, who really believed in it. And so I think it's a good class to end on, because it kind of opens up the complexity and of the historical negotiation from an intergenerational point of view, how a younger generation of artists are coming and also challenging the inherited narratives of their generation, of their parents. And in this class too, we look at in particular at the many, many works that have been made in Latin America that relate to the disappearances of so many people, 30,000 people in Argentina. And at different ways in which contemporary art can be used to try to keep alive memories of people who've been disappeared, but also continue to try to struggle to hold to account those responsible for those disappearances. Suzanne Meiselas' Reframing History, for example, project where she installed and transparent photographs taken during military conflicts, for example, in Nicaragua, back in the places where she originally took the photograph. And finally, opening out into, I think this year we ended with Regina José Galindo, which opens out bigger, longer questions about longer histories of violence and in particular indigenous rights. And she is always dealing also with the fragility of the human body in relation to the military industrial complex or the military environment. So that's a kind of very brief overview of what we cover on this course. Here is a picture. They look like Guantanamo Bay inmates, but they are my students. Perhaps this is how they experience the course. But this is a different cohort of students who published an article reviewing the course in our student magazine, and this is their self-portrait. Here they are 4 years ago at the Art Pool conference sleeping. These guys are really awake, but it's only 9 a.m. But this other course, it was very funny. So they were all, some of them at least, were sleeping in this conference. And they said here that, yes, that's me sleeping at the conference after copious Hungarian lunch provided by the Museum of Fine Art. Klara's 14-year-old daughter was rating the speakers. Yes, you heard right. While I, 25-year-old MA student, slept, she engaged with the conference and rated the speakers. My daughter's now 18 and not here. But so that's something from a student perspective. It's really nice to be able to bring them to this conference. And I wanted to end by just showing you some of the work because the whole point of this course really is that the students then go and do their own work. So they write 3 essays, 2 essays, a dissertation, and they make a virtual exhibition, all in a 9-month period. So as you will have seen, my course is like a kind of a survey. It's a bit of a greatest hits, and their job really is to identify all the holes and to go, well, why haven't we learned anything about what was happening in Bogota? Well, what was happening in Bogota? And then they go and find out, and they do their own work. But at least they've got some kind of a sense of an overview of things that they can put what they discover into dialogue with. They've got a useful theoretical framework. So the course has generated a lot of MA dissertations, probably about 100, all on East European and Latin American topics, and all available in our library. Some of them have gone on to be published as articles, and quite a few of students have gone on to do PhDs in this field. Some of the things here are PhDs. That's Marco's. Marco actually did the Global Conceptualism course, but then wound up working on self-management and student cultural centers. Gosia Miśniakiewicz did an amazing PhD, which she still hasn't put out as a book, but it's about Polish mail art. So you can see the diversity and how the students are looking at things that we didn't look at on the course. So empowerment in Puerto Rican contemporary art, the work of Felipe Ehrenberg, the search for home, the Budapest Off Biennial, Holocaust memory, negotiation of Roma stereotypes, Graciela Gutierrez Marx, Beatriz Gonzalez. This was a Bulgarian one about oil, when oil and blood mix. Very interesting. This was very good. Rupai, about the graphic novel dealing with violence in Peru. And lots of people often want to work on Chile solidarity. This was also very nice on El Techo de la Balena. This was somebody who really kept with the idea of doing these two regions together, which was ambitious and just brilliant. Art of Double Truth, Children of Perpetrators in Argentina, Lithuania, and Bosnia. So it's always really nice to see people really, what they do in their dissertations, and I'm looking forward to this year's dissertations, no pressure. And thank you very much for your time and attention, and the students are here, so if perhaps people can ask them questions too. Thank you.